Chapter 10. Jim had been working out since 5 in the morning. Something about the exertion burnt off the jet lag. It was probably the adrenaline, the endorphins, and the other sundry hormones that got pushed around his brain and kicked his circadian clock off the shelf, bouncing it into some new setting. The professor turned up a half an hour early and attempted to wait, but Jim had asked the front desk to look out for him and send him up as soon as he arrived. It was hard for a 1.5-arm man to hide, so he was sent up to Jim's suite accompanied by a liveried girl. Akira was toting a large, heavy rucksack that looked too big for him to carry any distance. Jim sat down in the lounge dining area of the suite and went off into the bedroom. He had left the coin on his bedroom table. He emerged and handed Akira the coin. Akira placed it on the table between them. "Going somewhere?" asked Jim. "Yes," said the professor. "Hiking?" "No." "You're going back, aren't you?" "Yes." "They won't let you in with that, will they?" "Likely not." "So that won't help you." "I have coats with many pockets. I bought them last night. I can put the contents in the pockets before arrival." "You said coats." "I did. One small coat and one large." "And you will be wearing both of them?" "I hope not." He looked at Akira, whose face remained impassive. "Is someone going with you?" said Jim after a pause. "I hope so." "Does he know how much danger he'll be in?" "Yes. He is a very great friend of mine and a true hero." "That's great. You're lucky to have a friend like that." "I am." The scar down Jim's scalp had started to itch furiously, and he rubbed it. "You are mad," he said. "I have tried for 15 years to have the shrine allow me to study it, but they refused. So we went to see it, the two of us, and we have unlocked the way, and now I can examine it without their permission. Can't you get a proper team together? One that won't simply disappear? The shrine would block such an expedition." "So you are going to go it alone?" "If necessary." "If it's real, you will never make it." "I have left instructions. You can ask after me in a day or two." "It's suicide." "That is an honorable path." "It's a stupid path." Akira was looking at him with a blank gaze. "So what is there to find? You wouldn't be prepared to die for a pile of old gold," said Jim. "The Buddha." "You mean the statue of Buddha from India?" "Yes, and Buddha inside the statue." "What, a mummy? The mummy of Buddha?" "Yes, but no." "Well, it's either the Buddha's coffin or it isn't." Akira looked pained. "The Buddha has gone beyond existence. He reached nirvana. But he is not dead. He is in deep meditation. His body lives while he is alive in meditation inside the Hibutsu." "Akira, what are you talking about? You want to go into a death trap and find Buddha, not a Buddha, but the Buddha, who impossibly is sleeping inside a statue that no one's seen for hundreds of years in a state of suspended animation. Am I getting this right?" "Yes." "But that's not possible." "I believe it is." "And what are you going to do if you are right, and you survive the journey and find him in his statue meditating? Wake him up?" "Yes." "You are going to wake up Buddha. You are going to pull him out of nirvana and oneness with the universe and drag his soul back to earth." "Yes." "Why would you do that? I mean, what did he ever do to you?" "Imagine Buddha back on this earth, able to teach us. Imagine the modern world with its mass communications, able to deliver sacred wisdom along its circuits to 8 billion people. What great good could be done? We are so close to the end of the world. We are destroying it before our eyes. If not by the slow death of our environment, we will surely suffer nuclear holocaust." Jim noticed his mouth was open, because he felt his tongue was about to fall out of it. He blinked as he shut his mouth. "So what you are saying is Buddha is alive and has been in deep meditation for 4,000 years in a statue in that shrine. Zenkoji. And you will wake him up so he can preach good stuff to the world and save us all. It's the seventh enlightenment, the word of Buddha himself. Jim recapped in his mind. Buddha alive. Impossible. Buddha's mummy in a lost statue. Impossible. A lost mummy at the end of a series of ancient lethal puzzles. Impossible. Well, at least nearly impossible. A series of ancient puzzles in an ancient shrine. Wildly improbable. Getting into a series of ancient puzzles in an ancient shrine. Extremely unlikely. The only thing that might happen was that past the key of enlightenment there was a trap. A key, a door, and a trap. That could happen. If there was, and they had found the way to unlock that room, then if Akira went in alone, he would be ensnared by it and die. You'll never make it, Akira. If you get into the maze, it will kill you. Akira smiled. I have to try. How can I not try? It's not the time to go straight to paradise, Akira, said Jim, pointing upward. I agree, but it is time to go far, and to go far is to return. Crap, said Jim. To go far is to end up lost, hungry, probably wet, and really wishing you'd charged your phone. Wish me luck? I'm not wishing you luck. Jim stood up. I'll go with you. If they turned the key a second time and a door opened, he'd knock out Akira and carry him out. The chances were approximate to 0 of there being any door, but if there was, he would make an intervention. It would be brutal, but he would have saved his friend's life. I'll try that coat on, he said. Thank you, said Akira, unzipping the rucksack quickly, as if Jim might change his mind. Jim struggled to put it on. It was far too small. Akihabara, said Akira. We can get more equipment there. Akihabara is Tokyo's electronic town where every possible white good and gadget is for sale. Its main street is a boulevard of high-rise shops, catering on each floor to a different category of consumer electronics. As the internet ate into its business of being the place where the latest electronics came to market, it had shrunk, but it was still the place to go if you wanted any kind of techno hardware. Jim and Akira left the Akihabara store that was full of the most sinister equipment imaginable. It was called Tactical Life, but Jim felt it might as well be called Rapist World. The handcuffs, stun guns, spy cameras, gags, and other such louche equipment seemed in stark contrast to the ultra-safe, crime-free society of Japan. The Japanese had a broad streak of fantasy in their genes, and with it, Jim suspected, came an army of fantasists that would collect all the equipment of a psychopathic creep, yet do nothing but fetishize over ownership. Clearly there were enough customers to keep the place open on one of the main shopping streets of Tokyo, and there seemed to be Western-sized perverts in Tokyo because they had a coat of many pockets that just about fitted Jim. It wasn't a perfect flowing fit, but it would have to do. They flagged down a cab. Tokyo Station. Yoshi's head perked up. The signal had fallen and was wobbling up and down and from side to side. He got up and pulled the alarm cord by the door. In the main refectory, a bell rang. The 10 monks who sat there looked at each other. "Twice in 2 days," said the abbot. "It's been a long time." "Maybe," said the oldest monk. "Maybe," said the abbot. 1967, said the old monk, smiling a broken-toothed grin. They rose and dispersed. The chief abbot looked up from his newspaper. "Again?" "Again," said the assistant abbot. The abbot rose and headed for the vestry of the main prayer hall. He had to be ready for when the visitor who had turned the key of enlightenment came from the tunnel. They would be offered the short service of enlightenment, and then he could get back to his paper. Jim shone the torch on the bronze key. It was shiny from the hands that had touched it and the acid sweat that had been left behind. "Look," he said. "It comes out, and then a full turn to the left moved something. I could feel resistance. Then the turn to the right moved something, but now it's not moving anything." He turned the key left and right. He shone the torch along the wall, and Akira did the same with his. "A door?" said Akira. Jim groaned. "It looks like one." He ran his fingers down the joints of the door. "It could just be the way they laid these stones," he said. He shook his head unconsciously. He had a sinking feeling in his stomach. "Let's go up," said Akira. "Let's see what happens next." "I've got a bad feeling about this," said Jim. Akira chortled. "What could be better?" With the aid of a torch, the walk out of the passage was effortless. The passage of life was much shorter with lighting. Jim turned his torch off as soon as the daylight above came into view. There couldn't be a door there. There just couldn't be. And meanwhile, he didn't want to offend any of the monks by a crass display of sacrilegious bad taste. "They want us to follow them," said Akira, as two happy monks indicated they should go to the nearby prayer hall to see the service. The presence of the monks made Jim keenly aware of the heavy items in his long coat, and he feared he would emit a random clanking noise at any moment as he walked behind them. They sat down a little away from the altar stage. The drummers entered, clinking and thundering, a droning song filling the high hall. Jim actually found himself enjoying the singing, as if, like any classic pop hit, mere repetition had improved the music to his ear. The abbot entered stage left. At the sight of them, he appeared to skip a pace. "That's not good," thought Jim. The service rose to its conclusion. The small section of the altarpiece opened, and inside they glimpsed some objects. There was a small gold statue, two silverish vase-looking things, and a hint of small items on the floor of the cupboard. The panel swung back, and the abbot delivered a short sermon to the tiny crowd of them and two other people. The monks drummed and left the stage, but the abbot stepped down off the front of the dais. He left by the entrance that led to the side and front exits and onwards into the shrine where the passage they had just traversed lay. Jim and Akira got up. "Let's go," said Akira. "You sure?" said Jim, hoping for an instant that Akira would say no. "Yes." They walked to the exit of the prayer hall. The abbot was stood back where visitors left their shoes. He was watching them. They turned left and headed for the tunnel. As Akira stepped onto the stairs, Jim caught sight of the abbot walking swiftly to the prayer hall. "That's not good," he thought. Chapter 12. Jim looked at Akira, who looked at Jim. "Okay," said Jim. "We pull the key out, turn it left, turn it right. Agreed." Yoshi looked at the abbot and the assistant abbot. They were staring at the signals. The assistant abbot was holding an old-looking scroll. Jim pulled the handle. "There was definitely a clunk," he said, looking at the professor. "Something engaged." He turned the key left. Click. "Oh," muttered Akira. Jim looked at him in the light of his torch. He just couldn't punch his old friend, even if it meant saving him. Akira looked too fragile. He looked too happy at the prospect of opening the door. And what was worse, Jim wanted to open the door too. "I can't believe I'm doing this," said Jim, his heart racing. "This is very stupid." He turned the handle to the right. There was a crashing sound, and the next moment all Jim knew was he was hanging by the bronze key, his legs flailing in midair. "Jim!" cried Akira from somewhere. The abbot and Yoshi gasped as the second signal dropped halfway down the hall. The assistant abbot unrolled the scroll and read. They looked at him, and the chief abbot asked, "What does it say?" "It difficult," he said, rereading the text. "It's only half happened. The signal has to fall again." "What is going on?" asked Yoshi. "What now?" asked the abbot. "We have to wait," the assistant abbot said. "Wait for the other half to fall." The chief abbot spoke. "Yoshi, tell the others to close the temple. Go now." Yoshi ran from the room. Jim's torch was dangling from a lanyard, clipped onto his coat. As he looked down, he could see the floor had opened below him, and somewhere far below a small area of water was glittering. He was dangling over a well, and the long drop would surely kill him. He had both hands on the key now, but he would not be able to hang there for very long. Akira stood in the passage to his right, his torch shining on him. "I'm going to try and swing over to you," Jim growled. "Grab me if you can. If I can get my feet over and up there, I can get out." But now the door was opening, and it was swinging him away towards the other side. He looked over his shoulder. If he could hold on, and if the door swung far enough, he could pull himself up a few inches and end up sat down on the passage floor. If the door kept swinging, it would cut him in half, or smash his legs. If he could stop the door, then he could extricate himself. It all depended on the weight and momentum of the door, if it was swinging under gravity or a counterweight, and whether he was fast and strong enough to pull off the maneuver. "You idiot," he thought as the door swung open. "You bloody idiot! What are you even doing here?" The door was almost open now. Holding on with one hand, he threw the other arm back to plant it on the top of the passage floor. His palm met the edge of the drop, and he reached back and levered himself up and propelled himself backwards over to the lip of the pitfall. The door was still swinging, the stone bottom like a guillotine knife that would slice him like a rind of bacon if he couldn't stop it or get his legs up out of the way. He propelled himself up and backwards again, jerking his knees as far as he could by pulling them back with his hands, so he was rolling backwards, his feet in the air. He rolled over completely and onto his knees, his heavy coat clattering around him and covering his head so he couldn't see. He shuffled away from the swinging door, totally blinded by the coat that shrouded him. When he guessed he was far enough away, he threw the coat back over his head and jumped up. He forced himself to snatch a stationary look. The door clunked fully open against the wall. He could see Akira on the other side of the pitfall. What was Akira doing? "No, wait!" Jim cried. "Don't!" Akira had jumped into the open doorway. Jim ran forward and looked into the doorway. Akira was looking out at him. "Are you coming?" Akira turned and looked into the darkness behind. "It's safe in here." "How's that?" said Jim, hearing himself panting. "It's a small room. I can't see any bones or bodies." Akira smiled in the uplighting from the torches. "But leave me to go on alone, I understand." "Get out of the way," said Jim angrily. "I don't want to fall down that bloody hole trying to get in the door." Akira moved back into the small room. Jim stepped across the void and entered the doorway. The roof had a low ceiling, and a few feet ahead was a green door. "Verdigris," said Akira. "Bronze. Very old." Jim shuffled over to the door. He could see it had openings in it, and once they reached it, they could see into the room beyond. They took turns in examining what was there. It was a black, dark room filled with cobwebs. "Is your Buddha in there?" he asked. "No," said Akira. "This is either the first enlightenment or the second. There are still at least 5 to go." "I don't think this door is locked. I think we can just go in," Jim said. "But we can still go back." "If we go forwards," Akira said, "we can still go back." "Okay," Jim said, starting to push on the door. "Get back, Akira. You might need to come save me if the floor collapses again." The door was moving, but only slightly. "There's a lot of resistance to this door," Jim grunted as he pushed. "A test," Akira said. "Of strength, perhaps." "This thing is going to snap shut if I don't keep pushing it," Jim said. It was getting easier. He groaned with the effort. "I'm hoping we will be able to pull it open if we need to go back. We can try to jam it open." "Okay, I'm getting some give now." The battle was being won. The door was swinging open with ease now. Jim gave it a final push. There was a booming sound and Jim looked around. The door from the passage had slammed close. "That's not good," he said. Yoshi's insides jumped around inside his skin. The second signal dropped down to the same level as the first signal. Chapter 13. "Come with me," said the assistant abbot. They stepped out of the signal room, stopping directly by a door with a paper seal over the lock. Yoshi looked at the door with a mixture of excitement and horror. They were going into the secret room, the room no one spoke about, the room referred to, but never directly mentioned. Was it an honor, or was it a curse? The chief abbot tore the paper from the box that covered the lock, then took out a small knife and chopped away a covering of wax-coated string. He pulled out a key from somewhere in his robes and unlocked the door. There were stairs that led down. There was an old light switch, dirty with age. Yoshi switched on the lights. Only one at the bottom came to life. They walked down. "This was last sealed in 1983, said the chief abbot. "It has been due for maintenance for 10 years. They walked into the dark room. The chief abbot's lighter flamed into life, allowing him to search. He found a switch, threw it, and lights came on. With a loud plink, one bulb went dark again. The assistant abbot closed the door behind them. "What now?" he said. He read the scroll, then looked around the room. "No going back now," said Jim, pushing on the door. It looked extremely solid, and even with the crowbars inside their coat pockets, it might take days to break through. He took out his phone. "No signal," he said. "Yours?" "None," said Akira. "Why not check it?" The professor took out his mobile. "Look, none." Jim shook his head. He was on the edge of laughing. He held up his torch. "Let's hope our portable sources of enlightenment last a long time," he said, swinging his torch beam along the roof. "When it runs out of batteries, we will be totally screwed." "We have more batteries," said Akira. "Let's go." The room beyond was filled with black ash and cobwebs. Jim pulled out a small chisel from one of the inner pockets of his coat and jammed it under the bronze door to prevent it from closing. "That should do it," he said. "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me," he recited in his head. They pushed through the webs, wrapping them up in their arms, sweeping them into balls of grimy candy floss. "Something's crushing underfoot," said Jim, pulling balls of ancient dirty spider silk from his arms and throwing it aside. "I know," said Akira. "Let's not trouble ourselves with that now." Jim looked down. It was a black sooty mess with crunching shards in it. He thought he saw a tooth. "This is bones," he said, disgust in his voice. "I know," said Akira. "Let's find a way out." "Door," Jim said, swiping the cobwebs out of the way. "There is a door in front of us." Akira squinted. So. Chapter 14. The assistant abbot said, "We have to light these logs." He stepped out of the way of the door to the oven. The chief abbot pulled the cigarette lighter out from his sleeve and handed it to Yoshi. "Light the fire." "Light the fire?" Yoshi repeated. "Yes, light the fire." "But those people are above, are they not?" he said. "The fire will suffocate them. They will be burnt alive." The abbots looked at each other. "Light the fire, good monk. It is not for us to wonder about the consequences," said the assistant abbot. "I'm not going to kill those people," cried Yoshi. The abbots looked at each other. "Have they not chosen the road to enlightenment? Are we to stand in their way?" "I'm not going to burn those people alive." He held out the lighter to the abbot. "Are you?" He shook the lighter as if the chief abbot was a fish that would take a lure if it moved. The chief abbot didn't move. "And you?" asked Yoshi, waving it in front of the assistant abbot. There was a flicker in the assistant abbot's eyes, but he did not take the lighter. "We must turn the wheel, then," said the assistant abbot, reading the scroll. He looked at a large ring mounted on the wall, like a great ship's wheel. "We will turn it together," said the abbot. "What does it do?" asked Yoshi. "It doesn't say," replied the assistant abbot. "It says it is for fate to fan the flames, but for man to turn the wheel of destiny." The chief abbot clipped Yoshi around the head hard enough for him to see stars. "It means we must turn the wheel, obdurate boy." The abbots went to the wheel and began to try and turn it. It didn't move. Yoshi hesitated, then ran to them and began to heave the wheel. Something somewhere gave, and behind the wall there was a low creaking noise and the sound of a distant rumbling. Chapter 15. There was a clang behind them. Jim and Akira turned. The bronze door Jim had wedged open had slammed closed. "That's not good," Jim said in a whisper. He looked up as the room rumbled and a shower of dust and black detritus suddenly showered down on them from above. They shone their torches upwards and tried to see the ceiling as the muck showered down on their faces. "The roof is moving," said Akira. "It's coming down." Jim looked around the room desperately, as if there might be a third door, as well as the one they had come through, which was now slammed shut, and the one ahead of them. He ran to the door ahead of them, frantically swiping the webs away. The door was set into the wall about 18 inches, and filled with untold years of cobwebs embedded with black dirt. He cleared the doorway, brushing and sweeping it to clear the space. Akira shone his torch on the door. It seemed to be a solid piece of rock. Jim pushed his weight against it. There was no give in it at all. "It's a wall," he said. "Let me see," said Akira. Jim backed out of the doorway and let Akira in. He was pulling at the thick matting of webs stuck all over him. "See anything?" he asked urgently. He looked up. The ceiling was coming down, little by little. He kneeled down and examined the floor. It had vents in it. The black was soot from a fire. "We're in an oven!" he cried. Akira looked around, and a shower of soot signaled another downward move of the ceiling. "We're in a wine press," he said. Jim began to search along the floor. "You keep looking at the door, Akira. There has to be a way out." Akira was sweeping through the webs, examining the wall. "We haven't got long," he said. Jim ran to the bronze door on the far side of the room. He pulled on it with all his might, but it had no give at all. "The crowbar!" he called to Akira, who ran and handed it to him. Jim pulled on it, and Akira did what he could to push on it with one hand. The crowbar was too short to get huge leverage, but they exerted a lot of force nonetheless. Again, there was no movement from the door. The ceiling was just above Jim's head height. He touched it. It was stone. As it moved a little lower, he felt the weight, enough to crush them. "Come with me," he said to Akira, and they ran to the far door. Jim jammed the crowbar into the gap between the ceiling and the wall. The ceiling twisted the tool and halted its descent. Jim let go of the bar. "Saved," he said, looking at Akira. "Now what?" "I don't know." The crowbar spat out from its jamming point and onto the floor with a clang. Jim grabbed it and rammed it back into the gap between the roof and wall. "If this won't hold it, we can use it as a support and lie flat." The crowbar came adrift again, and Jim jammed it back again. Jim was stooping now. "The doorway," said Akira. Jim looked at it and saw Akira stepping into it. "Is it open?" he shouted. "No, but it is safe." "Safe?" The crowbar slipped and the roof dropped inches, grazing the back of Jim's head. "Come, quickly!" Jim hobbled to the door. Akira stood in it. There was no falling roof in the doorway. "Get in!" cried Akira. Jim crushed into the small space. The ceiling was already below the top of the door. Jim shone his torch up to the lintel as the structure of the roof began to close the doorway like a cupboard door. "We may be entombed," said Akira. "I'm going to jam this crowbar against the floor and ceiling, and that will leave a gap that will give us air." "And if they start the oven?" "Why would they do that with the roof on the floor?" "Maybe they crush you first, then cook you." "What's that?" said Jim. Akira looked where Jim was awkwardly pointing his torch. "A gap." Jim reached up, and as the gap grew, he pushed his fingers into it. Then his arm. "I can't feel anything out there." He pulled his arm in. The ceiling lowered slowly. He jumped up with his torch and looked in. "This is a door. This is the way out. You're small enough to go through. I'll lift you up." They maneuvered in the tight space so that Akira was standing in front of Jim. Jim lifted him up and helped him climb through the small but growing gap. "We are okay," called Akira. Jim hauled himself up and through the gap. They shone their torches around. There were 4 iron pillars reaching down from the ceiling above. "These can't be that old," said Jim, running his hand down them. "19th century," said Akira. "Cast iron, not steel. Meiji. 1880s? Maybe later. The same iron as in the Eiffel Tower. So they upgraded their death trap recently. Wood can't last forever. Bastards," thought Jim. "So this is the second prize or the third?" he said. "I don't know. Okay, so we aren't burnt, and we aren't crushed, and we didn't fall down the flipping well. So that must be the 3 enlightenments. It will be what it is." The floor shook as it touched down on the floor below. Jim shone his torch up the iron beams to see if there was a gap big enough to climb up through. There was no apparent way to get above the ceiling that way. He ran to the bronze door, but it was wedged closed by the new floor. "We could saw through this door and get into the anteroom, then try to bust the next door open with the crowbar. That might take a couple of days." Akira looked over his shoulder at the bronze door. "Destroy such a wonderful 13th century masterpiece? You're not serious," said Jim. "It would be better to go on," replied Akira. "Any ideas, Professor?" Chapter 16. The Abbot looked at them. They had wound the wheel as far as it would go. "What now?" asked Yoshi, relieving the Abbots from losing face by asking out loud themselves. "We return to the room of observance," said the assistant abbot after examining the scroll again, which gave no clue. They made their way up the stairs. There was a small crowd of monks at the top of the stairs, and at the doorway to the room of observance. "Please go to your posts," the chief abbot ordered them. The monks backed away, wide-eyed, then turned and fled. There was plaster and dust all over the floor of the room of observance, and much of the far side of the wall had fallen in. There was an outline of a door in the middle of the wall where the bulk of the plaster had fallen away. The 2 abbots and Yoshi looked at each other, suddenly leveled to equally humbled men by the surprise. Yoshi stepped forward and tried to open the door, but pieces of wall still blocked its way. "We must open the door and go in." The abbots looked at each other, then at him. "We have to go inside and see what we are to do. Those people, if they are alive, they must be rescued. We don't know how to go backwards, but we do know how we can go forwards." "Yes," said the chief abbot. He spun on his heel and swept out. Jim was going around the room banging the crowbar against the stone walls. He was hoping one would ring hollow, but none did. He shined his torch up all the iron posts, but they disappeared into the stone roof, with an inch or so of clearance and no space to climb through for anything but a spider. He sat next to Akira. "It's the stone door," said Akira. "We must open it. If the ceiling goes up, we're going to have to climb into the doorway again. We can get flattened up there just as easily as we could have been underneath. If it starts to move, we have to be quick. This whole thing must be counterweighted, so it could go up fast." "I'm very sorry about this," said Akira. "I was so very selfish to ask you to come along." "Save that for when we are really screwed," said Jim. "Right now, this is just an adventure. When we are sat here dying of thirst, then you can apologize." "There are no bodies in here, so there must be a way out." "Either that or no one got this far since Meiji times," said Jim. "I wonder how many times the oven had been lit." "At least once," said Jim. The abbot strode into the observance room with a toolkit, but the door was already open. Yoshi had found a latch, pulled it and pushed it, and thrown his weight against the door until it had opened inwards. The assistant abbot had commanded him to wait, so they had stood there until the chief abbot had returned with a box of car repair tools. Go in, he said. Yoshi stepped in. "Electric light!" he exclaimed. "Did we know about this room?" mused the abbot out loud to no reply. None of the wall lights came on, but the light hanging from the ceiling obliged, and threw a brown shadowed illumination across the room. At its center was a stone altar with a tablet on it and a copper roll. The assistant abbot read the ancient, difficult text on the table. He went behind the altar. "Ugh," he groaned. They followed him. There was a small, steep staircase with no light below. The chief abbot picked up the copper rod. He looked at it and shook his head. "Instructions." The assistant abbot stared at the rod. "These instructions have never been opened." "Instructions?" asked Yoshi, to no reply. The abbot opened the toolbox and pulled out a pair of pliers. He looked up at Yoshi. "Get torches." He stood up and searched for a seam on the scroll. Finding one, he pinched it and started to peel back the copper. "It is stiff with age, like me," said the chief abbot. He looked at Yoshi. "Child, we cannot go down into the darkness without torches. Will you not go for them?" Yoshi started and ran off. Akira stepped into the doorway. "Ah!" he exclaimed. He stepped out with a smile on his face. He picked up the crowbar at Jim's feet and went back into the niche. Jim jumped up and followed him the few paces. Akira was crouching down a little. He pushed the crowbar into a hole in the wall. It went in about 6 inches. He pushed it hard, but it went in no further. He turned it, and it rattled around. He took the bar out. "There must be a key in the room somewhere." He stood up and walked out into the room. Jim climbed into the doorway and shone his torch into the circular hole. Akira was banging the iron beams with the crowbar. The side facing the door of the closest one thudded rather than rang. "Wax," said Akira. As he scraped away a soft, thick layer of oily matter, it was a compartment, filled with wax and covered with blacking, a classic masking technique of the Japanese since forgotten history. He held the torch in his short hand and dug at the filling with his right. There was a lump of metal in there. He prized it out. Holding the object in his right hand, he picked the hard wax off the key with his left. The key was a long barrel of bronze, with a thin shaft at the end poking forward a couple of inches. "A barrel lock key," he exclaimed. He turned and walked to Jim, who was squatting down next to the keyhole. "A key," said Akira. Jim looked up. The head of a long-necked screwdriver poked out of the keyhole, and he held a hammer in his hand. "That's great," said Jim. He rammed the butt of the hammer onto the handle of the screwdriver, and there was a deep clunking sound. Akira closed his eyes, then opened them again. "Quickly then," he said. "Agreed," said Jim. He pushed against the door that began to open slowly. "This is heavy," he grunted. With every shove, it opened a little more. Jim squeezed through the gap, and Akira followed. Akira took out a spanner from his pocket and laid it in the doorway so the door could not close. "I don't know why I bought spanners," he said. Jim looked skeptically at Akira's attempt at a door wedge. It looked solid enough, but his previous attempts to wedge open doors had looked good too. "Let's go very carefully," said Jim, shining his torch down a short corridor. He shuffled forward an inch at a time, pressing down on the floor as if it might cave in. The corridor opened up into a small vaulted area, and below was a cistern, a square area like a swimming pool. It was empty. The stone step Akira was standing on suddenly sunk with a clunk, and there was a distant creaking sound, followed quickly by a metal ping, a boom of the stone door slamming shut, and the sounds of a bouncing steel bar. "That's not good," said Jim, as he looked at Akira with resignation. Jim jumped down onto the floor of the cistern. There were little tunnels leading off. "What do you reckon?" he called to Akira. "Difficult," said Akira, who was sat on the rim of the cistern. "Difficult to get down." He pushed himself off the lip and dropped down with a thump. "You okay?" said Jim. "I'm fine." Chapter 17. Yoshi gave a little cry as he ran into the observance room. He dashed into the hidden altar room. "The third signal is dropped!" "They're alive," said the chief abbot, with more than a hint of relief in his voice. "No one has made it this far for 500 years, said the assistant abbot. "How do you know?" said Yoshi. "We don't," said the chief abbot, "but it is said. The scroll is marked from the reign of Emperor Irahito, late Go-Kogan. You cannot reseal a copper scroll without it showing the marks of its re-rolling. There are no such marks on this scroll." "What now?" asked Yoshi. "We go down the stairs," said the abbot. "You are honored to lead us, young monk," said the assistant abbot. "I am honored," said Yoshi. "Honored greatly," said the chief abbot. Yoshi reached and took the copper scroll from the assistant abbot, which was now almost in 2 pieces. The corroded green copper felt leathery to his touch. He tried to read the characters, but couldn't. "What does it say?" "We must descend," said the abbot. Yoshi handed back the scroll and took 2 torches out of the bag he was carrying and handed them to the abbot's. He took out his own. "First," said Yoshi, "I must light incense, and when it has burnt out, we will go, and I will go first." The abbot looked at him and each other in confusion. Yoshi took out his packet of Parliament cigarettes and tried to light up. His hand was shaking so much he could barely hold the cigarette end in the flame. The abbot leant towards him and reached forwards and took the box and then a cigarette. The assistant abbot did the same. Yoshi held out his flame, and they took the light. They smoked in silence. When they were finished, each monk retrieved a little wallet from their concealed pockets and placed their butts in their portable ashtrays. "Now it is time to descend," said Chief Abbot. He coughed a little. Akira shone his torch into a passage. "This is a swimming maze," he said. "Take the wrong path and you would drown." "The water channel must have been blocked, and the water in the tank just evaporated away." "This is 13th century, said Akira. "Perhaps earlier. Such a treasure." "Let's split up and find the tunnel that gets us out of here," said Jim. "These passages can't go far," said Akira. "No further than about a minute swimming. No one can survive much more than a minute without breath." "Where shall we start?" Akira looked at the entrance to the cistern above and the across the room. "We will be traveling forwards," he said, pointing across the room from the door. "So the least likely path is the entrance below the door we entered in." He pointed with his short arm. "So that is the least likely route, and therefore the one we should take." "Why?" "Monk logic." "Okay, I get it. That might have been some kind of bad joke back then. I'll go in the left one from that, and we go down to the end and come back again, say what we find, and then take it from there." Jim took his coat off. "Good luck, Akira. And you, Jim." Jim got down on his hands and knees and crawled into his hole. Swimming in would be difficult, but reversing out would be far worse. 30 seconds in, and you would be unlikely to make it back out again. The passage was a one-way swim into oblivion. The thought of drowning was especially nightmarish to Jim. There were many ways of dying, but he thought drowning seemed to be the worst. It was said to be a peaceful way to die, but all Jim could think of was the minutes of struggling for breath and of choking on water. Filled with water, the maze was a fiendish device, a game of Russian roulette with 7 bullets in the 8 chambers. There were 8 tunnels, so anyone who made it that far would have basically a 14th% chance of going on to the next challenge. Happy the passing of eons was on their side. The death trap had been broken by time. He crawled along the chute, which, like the dark tunnel of the original Passage of Enlightenment, twisted left and then right in a convoluted route. How could a swimmer hope to make this passage in one breath? It seemed impossible, and there wasn't anywhere to turn. Once the swimmer had gone around a couple of bends, he would be committed to go on, and likely die. As it was, without water, it was going to be a bloody difficult crawl to get out. "Aha!" he felt like saying. As he saw that ahead was a patch of darkness his torch didn't illuminate. It must be an opening. He sped up and shuffled out. The passage opened up. He could possibly clamber up if he wanted to. He looked down. There was water. He looked up. He could see the trap door that he had opened at the top and the shaft he had nearly fallen down. The exit was a well. He was sure it was the well he had nearly fallen into. He examined the walls. There were footholds to climb up. Yes, he thought. He pushed himself back into the passage and began to reverse himself out. It was going to be a long, painful process, but unless something went wrong, there was only the climb to get them out of this ancient death trap. He was suddenly full of energy. Within minutes, he was back out of the tunnel and into the cistern. Where was Akira? Akira! He called. He put his head into the tunnel Akira had disappeared into. Akira! He could hear Akira's distant reply. He crawled in. Beware! He could hear Akira warning. I'm coming! Slowly! Beware! Go slow! Akira was shouting back. I'm here, said Jim, looking at a drop down in front of him. Don't go down, said Akira. Don't go down. Okay, I won't. I went down, but now I can't get back up. Akira backed out of the hole on his back, pushing his legs into the air. If I had 2 arms, I might be able to somehow prise myself out, but with one I can't. Jim grabbed his ankles. This is going to be hard. Ready? Yes. Gripping Akira by the ankles, he pulled him up. Thank God you're small, he grunted as he lifted him with all his might. Akira was trying to lift himself up on the wall, but could get little grip or leverage. Jim had Akira's knees past the lip of the drop, and he folded them onto the floor of the passage. Akira winced in silence as Jim rearranged his grip so he was pinning his ankles. Most of Akira's weight was held on the back of his legs, jammed to the floor by Jim's own weight. Lift your leg up so I can get a grip behind your knee. There was grunting from below, and Jim forced his grip behind Akira's knees. Jim could feel his knuckles being ground into the gritty floor. Jim braced himself. Here we go! Jim heaved. He yanked Akira high, and his friend struggled to fold up at the waist so Jim could pull him up into the passage. I'm out, groaned Akira, the top half of his body still suspended over the drop. I'll pull you in a bit, then we can get out of here. Thank you, said Akira breathlessly, shuffling backwards. It would have been a miserable death. I'm sorry, but this is my fault. Yes, said Jim. But let's get out first, before you apologize properly. My tunnel gets us out of here. Excellent news, said Akira between breaths. Jim was smiling because they were nearly safe. There was just a nasty climb up the well, and they would be safe. They both had ropes, and the walls of the well were rough with flat layered stone, making for an easy climbing surface. Unless there were more surprises, they would be out of the tunnel of enlightenment and back amongst the tourists in a few minutes. They stood in the cistern, brushing themselves down. Have you got the harness? Said Akira. Jim checked his coat. No. I need a harness if you are going to pull me out of the well. He began checking his own coat. They were looking at each other in panic. I've got it, said Akira. Sorry. Jim pulled out his coil of rope. Give me yours and I'll splice it to mine. There isn't going to be any room in there to make any preparations. Chapter 18. Yoshi looked at the bronze wheel set in the wall. Turn it, said the abbot. Yoshi looked doubtfully at the device. What horror would it set in train? It is not meant to help them, is it? Who are we to say? Replied the abbot. Turn the wheel, shouted the assistant abbot. Obey, you arrogant child. You turn it yourself, said Yoshi. He gave the abbot an angry look. Do your own dirty work. Yoshi turned on his heels and ran, his robes flapping. The assistant abbot rubbed his chin and looked at the chief abbot. So, said the chief abbot. They looked at each other and then at the wheel. They stepped over to it and began to try and turn it. It didn't budge, yet it didn't feel like it wasn't going to turn. They could feel it had give in it, and would, if bothered enough, start to turn. They continued their struggle. The passage didn't seem as far the second time Jim crawled along it. "Are you okay back there, Akira?" asked Jim. "Domo, domo." Jim's head popped out into the well. He shone his torch upward. It was probably 30 or 40 feet to the top. Easy, he thought, to buoy himself up. He shone the light into the water to see if it was deep. He groaned. "I wish I hadn't done that," he told himself out loud. "What is it?" inquired Akira from behind. "It won't improve your day." "No, tell me. What is it?" "There's a whole lot of bones in this well." He shone the light around in horrified fascination. "There are a lot of dead people in here. I can see 3, maybe 4 skulls." Akira cried out. "What's wrong?" said Jim, immediately knowing. Water was trickling through the tunnel. "Let's get a move on," he said urgently. The tunnel entrance was about 4 foot high, enough to stand up in, stooped and with bent knees. He clipped his torch to his belt. It would hang face up as he climbed. Jim put his hand above the top of the opening. The gap between the flat stones was more than enough to get a firm hold. He jammed his feet into the gaps on the opening sides and began the climb. "There's footholds in the wall," he called down to Akira, who was shining his torch up at him. "Don't think I can get up without you and a rope," he called to Jim. "Got it," replied Jim. "How's the water?" he asked after another step up. He could hear it trickling into the well. "Coming slowly." Jim was 10 foot up from the entrance. "So far so good," he said, feeling for the next handhold. There were several ways to go. He got himself set firmly, then took the torch hanging by a lanyard and pointed it upward. It looked like the route went right, then left to the top. If he took a different route, he could end up near the top, but no way forwards. Then he would need to climb down again and back up another way. "This is some kind of climbing maze," he shouted down. "You'd never make it in the dark." Akira watched the water fall from the passage into the well. It wasn't much of a threat, but upside down in the U-bend Jim had just pulled him out of, he would have likely been dead already, as the passage immediately flooded. Right now, he might be left cowering at a dead end, waiting for the slow rise of the water to creep up and finally fill his nostrils. "Nearly there," called Jim. He set himself firmly into position hanging from the wall. He looked up. He could see the key to enlightenment above. To his right was the trap door that had fallen. That was a smooth surface that hung into the well, and not something easy to climb up on. The well ended at the door, and there was no hold there either, or any on the opposite wall. The only way out was on the left wall, and the grip on the stones of the last few feet was sketchy. The final 4 feet may as well have been 100. He fumbled in his top pocket. "Ah, my trusty screwdriver," he muttered. He began to try and find a niche to his top left, to jam the tool into the wall. Useful, he thought, as it sunk in a couple of inches. He jigged and pushed it into the crevice, and it sank in further. 4 inches should be enough. He pulled out a large pocket knife and opened it, and worked it into a crevice about waist height. He was going to step up onto the knife, then the screwdriver, and try reach the top. It looked just about high enough. He calculated his moves. His right foot had to end up on the screwdriver step. If his left foot went there, he would be unable to make the next move. He pulled himself up onto the knife, and then stepped onto the screwdriver and stood up. He would have to fall forward to get his hands on the ledge. Then what? He didn't have much of a choice. He had to continue the move, or he would simply come adrift and fall. It was only perhaps a foot, maybe 18 inches, but it seemed like a wide void. He kept his weight forward, and it propelled him. His hands were out, ready to grasp, but the light flashed and flickered, and he had no idea where the rim was. His forearms hit something hard, and he was gripping, holding onto something. The light returned. He was looking up at his fingers gripping the edge of the well. His feet were struggling to find a hold and scrambled in vain. He couldn't hold on for long, and it would take a massive effort to pull himself up by his fingertips, one he doubted he had the strength for. Unthinking, he heaved himself, his legs flailing, kicking to catch a point of purchase to push himself up. It was like trying to deadlift a huge weight, without knowing if it was too heavy for him to lock elbows to prevent it falling down to crush him. The heavy long coat was no help. If he fell, he would die, and so would Akira, trapped at the bottom of the pit with no way to climb out. His whole body felt like it was turning to some kind of hot, burning fluid. His feet were desperate to get some kind of hold. His arms racked with effort, his muscles bunched and on fire, his shoulders racked, his fingers in agony. He just needed to get his chin over the edge. Just an extra 5 or 10 pounds of lift would get him there. But he wasn't going to make it. He wanted to drop back on his arms, as if somehow he could get his strength back for another go. But he knew if he stopped desperately pulling, that would be the end. He was growling and grunting, screaming inside to somehow summon up the extra power to pull himself the extra few inches. His mind was on his feet. Contact with a little bump would be all it took to propel him that few inches. Instead, his feet slipped and ground over the surface. A few more moments and he would be exhausted. His grip would slip and he would plummet to join the bones below. His fingers would give in at any moment. Now, Akira, you can say sorry, he thought. He let out one last roar, pulling strength from inside that tiny, hidden place, which should never be tapped. He rose in a sudden rush, 3 inches perhaps, but the energy vanished, his final reserve drained by the effort. It's over, he thought. Something froze his right arm, as if it was locked in place. He looked up and saw a form above him, a dark shape. He was lifting himself again with the aid of the pull, quickly rising from the well. He fell on his face, and for a moment lay still. Then he rolled over. It was a young priest, blotted out except for the halo from a torch beam. Jim pulled the rope out from inside of his coat. "My friend," he said. "I have to get him out." Jim was about to drop the end of the carabiner end into the well, but Yoshi took it and leaned over the well, threading the end through the key of enlightenment. They lowered the rope down together, Jim's arms vibrating like an agitated jelly. The water was flowing faster now, and it started to lift the water level of the well. But that had been secondary to Akira, who had thought Jim was about to plummet to his death right in front of him. Somehow, Jim had made it, and now the rope was being fed down to him. "Please let the rope be long enough," he called. "No problem," called Jim. Was that Jim up there? He thought. His outline looked strange in the yellow-hued gloom. 2 people, 1 small Japanese professor? Easy work, said Jim. "Please pull," said the priest in English. "Slow." Akira felt the tug, and the force lifted him from the tunnel entrance and swung him rather quickly across the well. He crashed into the far wall. "Ouch!" he said, bracing himself away with his long arm. He was rising quickly, and he shone his torch on the wall ahead. There were footholds in the wall, and what was more, there was what looked like a tunnel entrance ahead. He wondered if Jim had seen it on his climb. If he was climbing up the other side, his back would have been turned to it. His head rose up to the bottom of the entrance. He rose another foot. "Stop!" he called, still rising. "Stop!" He shone his torch in. It was definitely another tunnel. They could definitely crawl down it. "You okay?" called Jim. "Yes, another tunnel is here." "Pull," said Jim, and Akira started to rise. "Wait!" "No way," said Jim, quietly enough that the priest might hear. "Pull." "Another tunnel!" shouted Akira. "Yes," shouted Jim, "nearly out of the tunnel." "No!" cried Akira. "Another tunnel!" "We got you!" shouted Jim. Akira's head appeared in the torchlight. Jim took the whole of his weight, and the priest darted forwards and took Akira by the arm and pulled him to safety. Akira looked at the priest, blinking. "Thank you." "It is an honor," said Yoshi. "I am so sorry for your troubles." "I apologize for needing your help. Who are you?" "I am the soon-to-be ex-monk Yoshi of the Temple Zenkoji."
Pleased to meet you.
Akira and Yoshi stood and bowed to each other in the gloom, while Jim looked on in Western disbelief. "Let's get out of here," said Jim.
"There's another tunnel,"
said Akira. "I heard you," said Jim.
"Down in the well,"
said Akira.
"Oh,"
marveled Yoshi. "I guess that."
"What shall we do?"
asked Akira rhetorically, meaning, let's go back down. "We should get out of here." The torchlight showed nothing on Akira's face, but a thick atmosphere of disappointment seemed to rumble from him, like a sound too low to hear. "Let's go," said Jim. "I don't know about you, but I'm happy to be alive." Yoshi said something in Japanese to Akira, then said, "Back down there must be death. Let's go." The tunnel of enlightenment was much shorter when it was lit by torches, and they were soon out and climbing the stairs. The chief abbot and the assistant abbot were waiting at the top. The abbot was gently smiling, but the assistant abbot's face was as fixed and angry as a guardian statue. "I'm disgraced," whispered Yoshi into Jim's ear. "I'm with you now." Jim turned to him and put his arm round Yoshi's shoulder and gave his rescuer a one-armed hug.
"You bet." "They want us to follow them back to the altar," said Akira.
The assistant abbot was giving Yoshi the evil eye that seemed to reflect off the young monk's face and slap Jim's. "Fuck you very much," said Jim to the assistant abbot, in a manner indistinguishable from "thank you very much." The assistant abbot bowed. "Stick with me, Yoshi," Jim said to the monk. The abbot seemed unsure about Yoshi as they walked to the main hall. Was he one of them to be severely punished, or had he left them and joined the pilgrims? As they approached the hall, a swarm of 4 monks ushered them in front of the altar, and as if by some kind of magic trick, the abbots were gone. There were at least a dozen kneeling monks on the stage, and the moment Jim, Akira, and Yoshi settled, they broke out in drumming, bell clanking, and song. Jim looked around. The 4 ushers were sat behind them, and he felt an ominous shiver run down his spine. "Creepy music," he said to Akira.
No, said Akira. "Very ancient and very beautiful."
Jim concentrated on the music, as if that might make it somehow better. "What are we waiting for?" Yoshi spoke to Akira.
"The monk says this is a special ceremony, a special honor performed only for kings and dignitaries."
Pumped up with a soup of adrenaline and other brain hormones, Jim could only respond in terms of pejoratives. "Sounds like they don't get much practice," he noted. "Ah," he said as the chief abbot, wearing a new outfit, strode onto the stage. "That's what we're waiting for, a costume change." The abbot began to talk. He smiled kindly out onto the non-existent crowd, as if the 3 kneeling figures in front of him were only a small part of a larger congregation. Akira leaned sideways towards Jim. After a long pronunciation from the chief abbot, Akira translated, "Welcome." "Is that it?" said Jim.
"Yes."
The abbot was almost singing, whatever it was he was saying.
"What's he saying?"
asked Jim. The abbot paused. Akira translated.
"He says, 'Well done.'"
"What else did he say?"
"That was all. Well done."
Before Jim had time to protest, the chief abbot was flapping again, waving his hands to the ghosts in the ethereal crowd around Jim, Akira, and the runaway monk. "What is he saying now?"
"The shrine is one big mystery to them, and we are lucky to be alive."
"Amen," said Jim. The assistant abbot appeared with 3 more monks. There was a furious thundering of drums and a concerted cry that raised in note like a long drawn-out surprised yelp. Doors moved on the altarpiece. The small door on the right rose as it did before, but this time 3 more along the length of the altarpiece also rose. The monks each went to the cupboards, and at the signal of another rising yelp, retrieved an item. They proceeded to turn, and to a drum pattern like a heartbeat, proceeded towards Jim, Akira, and Yoshi. They laid the items down on the floor in front of them, a statue and 3 boxes.
4 enlightenments, 4 presents, said Jim.
looking at the first, a gold statuette, looking rather like a religious Oscar. The second was a box, which its monk opened. It appeared to be full of gold squares. The third was opened, this time full of rough-looking colored stones. Jim looked at the fourth item, which from his vantage point appeared to contain a gem-encrusted scroll of some kind. The chief abbot cried out an incantation. "Take these treasures and leave," translated Akira. Akira leaned forward and took a coin from his left hand, then peered at it and passed it to his right hand. "Edo period," he said. He picked out a handful as Jim extracted some stones. "I don't know anything about gems," he said, "except you can know it's stone by tapping it on your teeth." He did. "Well, it's not plastic," he said. Yoshi was offering the scroll to Akira, who poured the handful of coins back in the box and took it. "More interesting," he said. "A very early picture scroll." Jim picked up the gold statue. "Priceless?" "Priceless trinkets," said Akira. "Jim, we must go back. Help me reawaken the Buddha." "The Buddha?" gasped Yoshi. "Reawaken the Buddha?" Akira turned to him. "Yes, the final enlightenment is to touch the Buddha, who I believe lies sleeping here deep in meditation." "Oh!" exclaimed Yoshi. "I will help you." "Oh, crap," said Jim, jumping to his feet. "There is no sleeping Buddha here. You can't meditate for 2,000 years. Akira rose. "Jim, thank you for helping me this far. I must go on." Yoshi appeared to levitate from his cross-legged position. Jim looked at Yoshi and breathed in. It would take him exactly a quarter of a second to knock the monk unconscious. Then he blinked and saw that the young monk was standing in a karate guard, palms out, arms bent. "You know what I'm thinking?" asked Jim. "Yes, I think so," replied Yoshi. "Ah, crap. I'm not going to fight you around this temple." Akira looked shocked. "Go, Jim. Leave us to our destiny." Jim rubbed his eyes with his knuckles and started to laugh. "So my choices are, I can fight this guy Yoshi who just saved my life, and if I can bust him up enough, you'll have to leave with me so you won't kill yourself down there. Or I can walk off with a box of rocks and let you get killed in the death trap below. Or I can go with you and we can all get killed together." Akira and Yoshi looked at him. Jim looked at Yoshi. Standing with the right pose and withstanding an attack were two different things. All it would take was one good punch and the matter would be settled. Jim sighed, and the tension went out of his body like someone that had dropped a heavy sack. "Okay, let's go." "Go down or out?" said Yoshi, his outward palms like a pleading gesture. "Down," said Jim. "Let's go to paradise together."